Nation! Welcome back to another installment of Fart History. Cut that, I'm actually gonna do that again. That's about to piss me off. Hello Broski Nation, welcome back to another episode of Art History, aka Fart History, aka the series I do on this channel to make art history a little bit more palatable to those who would like to know more. I am not an art historian. I am just a student of life. If you are doing actual research, do not use my videos as artistic sources. This is just for fun, it's to help you learn something, and I've listed all my sources in the description if you'd like to go watch those videos. They come from much more credible expert sources on Mark Rothko. So without further ado, you probably have seen some of these paintings before. You may have looked at them and thought, not only could I do that, but I think a literal baby child could do that in the same sort of style. And you're not wrong, but what a baby lacks is the philosophy and life approach worldview that Mark Rothko had. I'm going to launch into what I think these paintings are significant for, as well as the art community in general. But I also have my own personal interpretation, which I know that a lot of y'all like to hear me talk about what I think, because look at me. I look like someone who needs to share their opinion. Let's get into it. Who is Mark Rothko and who gives a shit? That's the title of the video. Who gives a shit about Mark Rothko? Hey, I do, okay? And you should too.
But I do know that many of those who are driven to this life are desperately searching for those pockets of silence.
Mark Rothko, born Marcus Rothkowitz, was a Russian Jewish immigrant to the United States. In 1903, he was born in Russia, and around the age of 10 years old, moved to Portland, Oregon. Mark Rothko was a deeply troubled individual, as most artists are. He was prone to depressive episodes, depressive mental states. Throughout all of his work, you can see a sort of intrigue and obsession with the tragedy of being human, as he called it. He's what we would refer to today as a New York School abstractionist, or just an abstract expressionist. And he was very much ahead of his time with what he was doing. And I know you're looking at some of these paintings and listening to me say that and being like, girl, can you really be serious for a minute? And I will be, just hold on. Rothko was ahead of his time for being on the forefront of the abstract expressionist movement into the 60s and 70s. With a Rothko work, which I'm gonna launch into it, don't worry, we'll get there. With a Rothko work, the viewer is just as important as the painter. Without the viewer, these works are not complete. So I'll give a short little background as to who Mark Rothko is. Born in 1903 in Russia, and in 1913 his father moved them to Portland in the United States because he was dodging the draft for the Russian military for what would come to be World War I. And once they moved to Portland, his father died a few months after, actually. 10 years later, 1923, he moves to New York City to pursue painting full-time. And in this time period, so this is the 20s, this is, you know, the roaring 20s, he studies under Max Weber. He's learning about Cubism and Matisse and the Impressionists and German Expressionists. And so he's really filling that jar with all of the sort of wide array of artistic marbles, so to speak. His early works in the 1930s were actually figure-oriented. They incorporated bodies and objects and honestly explored themes like surrealism. And we get some really interesting works out of this time, but it is so vastly different from what's easily recognizable today as a Rothko. So now we're moving into the 1940s. Now, remember, this is wartime. Around this time, he starts reading a lot of Nietzsche and Carl Jung, and he's exploring the unconscious mind, which is different from the subconscious mind. In 1943, he writes a letter to the New York Times encouraging a shift away from the academic approach to art. In this letter, he says that with the rapidly changing world and the ongoing tragedies of World War II, following artistic traditions was not only irrelevant, but irresponsible. This is a quote from Rothko. There is no such thing as good painting about nothing. We favor the simple expression of complex thoughts. After this letter and this time period, probably like the mid-40s, he starts toying more with painting concepts and ideas more so than figures or settings or even like surrealist dreams. He's painting really complex, deeply complicated concepts. That's quite a feat. Around this time in the mid-40s, he starts diluting his paints. He's doing thin washes of paint over the canvas in horizontal and vertical lines. He's painting squares and rectangles, circles, amorphous shapes. It's kind of just, it reminds me of when you rub your eyes real hard, and it's what you see when the light's still shining on your eyes through your eyelids. That's kind of what, when I look at these early Rothkos, it's like, okay, I get it, I get it. Okay, 1947. This is a transitionary period for Rothko. The war is over, and this is the time that color field paintings are born. This is what Rothkos are called. They're color field paintings. He numbered these instead of titling them. They range from having anywhere from 2 to 4 different rectangles or fields of color. This style would come to be easily recognized as his signature style. What Rothko was attempting to do was convey the complex inner psyche of the human mind, which is difficult to show and verbalize. But once you see it, it's almost like you intrinsically know it. You're familiar with it. He stops offering explanations for his work. The only thing he says is silence is accurate. He didn't want any input from his own mind or his own experience or his own ego to cloud that sort of communication between the idea and the viewer. There should be no obstacle between the painter and the idea and the idea and the viewer. He's quoted as saying, "I'm interested only in showing human emotion, specifically tragedy." This was a big theme through a lot of, interviews with Rothko, and when you kind of get down to the basis of his philosophy, his obsession with tragedy and how the human condition is tragic. Humans innately look for meaning and purpose in life. But what you come to find out is Rothko's works do not offer any consolation in this regard. His works are not expressive. They don't represent him in any way. He did not wish for his artwork to be a sort of story of his life. I think naturally it kind of is, especially when you see the color palette trend towards the end of his life. It gets a lot darker as his mind kind of, spirals into the cavern of depression. By and large, I don't think these works really represent him. They're mirrors of the soul. That is a quote from Peter Seltz, who was the curator of his 1961 MoMA exhibit. Rothko's works are subjective, like any art is. I think of it like this. If you are out in nature, you're on a walk, you're going somewhere, and you see a tree and you hear a bird chirping, you can see it as just that, of what it is. That's nature. Of course a tree would be there. Of course, that's what they do. That's what nature is. It's just there. But if you look at it through the lens of against all odds, that tree is alive. It's providing oxygen for me to breathe and for you to breathe. The bird sits in the Can I talk? The bird sits in the tree and chirps. It sings its song. And the audacity for nature to be not only cohesive and interconnected and natural in its process and surviving. These two things have survived against all odds. It has the audacity to be beautiful on top of that. If you take that philosophy and apply that to life, I think that's what makes it subjective. It's how you want to interpret it. It's how it hits you. There are some days that I'm in a pissed off mood and I don't see the singing birds and the trees as the miracle that they are. But some days you'll see a sunset, or you'll go to the beach and you'll see just the mass roaring infinite waves. And you feel so small and you see how beautiful the world is. That feeling is what a lot of people feel when they look at a Rothko. It is, like I said, a mirror of the soul. You look into a Rothko and you see yourself. You see what it is to be human. You see what it is to be alive. Rothkos are described as deceptively simple, because it is. This is either an oil or egg-based wash that he does, but upon closer look, you can see that trained, academically studied painter that is beneath the surface. There's a lot of painterly technique and skill that I think he drew from the early days of studying under, some of the masters. One thing about these canvases, they're massive. They are human-sized for the most part. He meant for them to be proportional to the human body, and they're meant to be walked up to. A Rothko should never be roped off or, behind glass or anything like that. They're meant to be approached, and they're meant to be stared into and to lose yourself in them and to truly experience it. Not to look at it from afar or dissect it from an academic standpoint or even, God forbid, an art critic come and try to take it at its face value. It is meant to be a physical and spiritual connection between the observer and the work. The idea here is that color, in its essence, should call out basic human emotion. You should be called to these works because the colors are so intense. And now this is where it kind of gets a little pretentious. I will admit that straight off the bat, okay? I've kind of been sucking on Rothko a little bit. I will admit this is where it kind of started to lose me, but I get it. I'm here, but it's like, all right. He described this as pure art. Now, pure art as the elimination of all obstacles between the painter and the idea, between the idea and the observer. And if you want to define pure art as squares on a canvas, that's where, some people get lost. And trust me, I understand. But for a second, indulge me and try to, dive into these paintings. To Rothko, art wasn't meant to be a subject of academic discourse. Art is how we, as humans, for some reason, it's how we process life. We have got to create to understand and process the depth of our condition as humanity, the depth of our souls and of our lives and of our purposes. That's a very daunting, scary thing if you think about it for too long. If you veer off the path of familiar, daily, mundane tasks and things as simple as working a job. If you think outside of that bubble, it's a scary thought. It's floating through the abyss of what it is to be human. And I think what it is to be human is so simple, but at the same time so complex. And there's so many whys. And things like this, Rothko works attempt to answer that question, but only as much as you allow yourself to be able to answer it. I want to take a general art history break. So some of you probably will know this term. You may have heard it before, but maybe not in the sense of in art history. I want to mention the idea of the sublime. In art history, the sublime is a common trope seen in 19th century romantic paintings. And I don't mean romantic as in love. I mean romantic as in romanticism, which was an art movement. The sublime is an overwhelmingly threatening, dangerous force that is, while intimidating, awe-inspiring and uncontrollable in nature. It's humanity subsumed. Subsumed means to be under the control of something. Like we as humanity think we're at the top of the food chain. No, the sublime, nature is. The sublime is greatness beyond comprehension, beyond calculation, beyond measure. Now, it's often shown through natural imagery, through things like giant mountain ranges or, rolling clouds in the sky or a roaring sea. Things that are just greater than the human mind can really, I think, fully comprehend. It's immense. It's impetuous. It shows the fragility of human life when compared to the awe-inspiring, awesome power of nature. A lot of these paintings too, it'll be, like I said, these grander than life natural imagery, and then you'll see a tiny human figure in the foreground, or you'll see a tiny animal. It's meant to show the scale of just how tiny we are. Wanderer Over the Sea is a great one. That's the classic example people use of the sublime or of just romantic art in general. In Wanderer Above the Sea, we see this anonymous figure who really represents all of us, I think, with his back turned to us, and he is looking out upon this incredible natural scene. And it shows you the world goes on, never stops forever. And you are so, so, so small. And the things in your daily life can feel so overwhelming and so all-consuming. But paintings like this and pieces like this remind you that that's not the case. I get the feeling of the sublime. When I look at sublime works, I get that feeling when I look at Rothko's. What he was attempting to do to sum up everything, everywhere, all at once sort of thing of the entire human experience, the human condition on a canvas. What a feat and what a challenge. The joy and the tragedy and everything in between. He attempted to do just that, and I think by and large he was very successful. Standing in front of a Rothko is supposed to spiritually transport you somewhere else. Where that place is, I don't know. It's individualistic. It's up to the person looking at the piece. Whatever that might be. If it's grief, if it's loss, if it's love, if it's hope, if it's despair. You have to make sense of the images yourself based on your own life experiences. I can't do that for you. Rothko can't do that for you. he has stripped away all markers for how the human brain processes visual information. There are no figures, there are no objects, there's nothing to trigger that sort of memory or connection in your brain of something. It is entirely based on your worldview. For any work of art, art impacts different people in different ways. He wanted to create an overwhelming sensory experience when standing in front of his works, to come into contact with the undefinable. He's asking you to confront human tragedy. He's asking you to look at these paintings and fall in. What do you see? What do you feel? I imagine that process was quite freeing, like finally getting to the point of being like, this is the only way I can accurately, to the best of my ability, express that concept of tragedy, of being man, of mankind's plight. And in doing so, throwing all the artistic conventions out the window. You're no longer limited to having to paint figures or things like that, or having to do it accurately, or as a movement, the confines of the movement would accept. He threw all artistic conventions out the window. And I think that's what makes Rothko truly incredible, is he made art no one had seen before. Do you know how hard that is? Especially in the 40s, 50s, 60s, everyone was so pretentious. He's making art no one has seen before. Some people describe sitting in front of a Rothko as a very spiritual, religious experience, which I'll come back to later in a second. So we're moving into the 1950s now. Rothko has secured himself as a sort of global superstar. He goes to Europe and is met with critical acclaim, really, really celebrated in Europe for what he was doing. And as he got more successful and famous, the unhappier he got. I think that's relatable for a lot of artists, and it's also very isolating, and it's very easy to feel secluded and misunderstood. Because to Rothko, he was characterized as an abstractionist, but to him, he was so much more. He wasn't attempting to, have these accolades and be this famous art. He was not in it for the money. He was in it for the sake of the challenge he put in front of himself, which was to accurately display and portray the human condition. And in the art world, especially when it comes to Rothko and this whole era of abstractionists, it was a status symbol. People see these paintings as decor, as a prize to be won and to be owned. To him, it was so much more than that. And it was a slap in the face to be, the subject of debate on watching his art turn commercial. Around this time, he was really moved by his trips to Italy, where he would visit a lot of museums, a lot of churches and cathedrals, and see a lot of murals and different exhibits. So let's talk about this piece. This is one of his most famous. This is going to be Black on Maroon from 1958. And if you really look at it, this painting is not black at all. This painting is a range of different shades. It's blues, it's grays, it's burgundies, it's wine, it's red. But then underneath it all, it is black. But what is black if not the amalgamation of all the colors? I want you to try to guess the estimated value of this piece of art. Just throw out a number. Wrong! $35 million. This is a $35 million painting. But then again, when it comes to art, what are people paying for? Are they paying for the notoriety? Are they paying to say that they own a Rothko? Are they paying just to be the highest bidder? You can't trust people's integrity or intentions when it comes to art auctioning. I mean, when you start talking about how it's a tax write-off for a lot of rich people, Rothko just saw through all that bullshit and he fucking hated it. He hated it. Around this time, the late 50s, early 60s, Rothko moves away from the brighter tonal palettes and he starts experimenting more with a darker palette, with darker, sadder, almost treacherous colors, I would argue. Now, this piece, coupled with the Serra Murals, which I'll talk about here in a second, I think really showcase his declining mental state and his slow descent of giving into that spiral of depression and having that be reflected in his works, even if some art historians argue, no, that's not true. But I think, yeah, it's kind of like Goya. It's kind of like any of these artists when towards the end of their life, when either a medical condition takes over or the loss of their abilities or faculties or just bodily control or mental control. It's devastating and you see it reflected in their work. I personally think that's the case with Rothko, but to be revealed. I kind of find comfort in the fact that 70 years ago, when he was painting these, this man felt the same way I do sometimes, living in the digital age with every bit of information you could ever want to know literally at your fingertips with your cell phone. I mean, it's just constant and deafening, and it's overwhelming, and it's anxiety inducing, and there's fear there. And to have that sentiment echoed 70 years ago, and to be able to look at a painting like this and feel the same way, know that he was feeling the same way, or anyone back then, the same way that I do now, it's comforting in a certain sort of sad way. But my personal interpretation of this piece is it's only all-consuming if you let it be. And that's sort of the central idea of what's called absurdism. Absurdism is a philosophy that acknowledges the inherent lack of meaning in life, yet maintains a positive outlook, because each one of us individually can find our own purpose and find our own meaning in our own lives, and acknowledge that it's absurd everything that we live through and have to deal with, and the confines of our human experience is absurd. Once you accept that and let it go, then you can find real purpose. And I think that's my philosophy when I look at a Rothko is, it brings me to that mental state of deep introspection, and it makes me feel small, and I get a little panicky and I get a little anxious, but that's not where I end up. I always make it out on the other side of it doesn't have to be like that. Now, moving into the 60s, I mentioned earlier the Serra Murals. Let's talk about those. These are tea, bitch. What is that? I don't like living alone. It scares me sometimes. The Serra Murals were originally commissioned to hang in the brand new Four Seasons, which was in the Seagram building in New York City. They wanted these paintings to be hung in the restaurant that was going to be in the Four Seasons Hotel. They contacted Rothko to do a series of almost 30 canvases that were supposed to be hung around the entirety of the restaurant. He accepted the commission and got to work on it. And he's quoted as saying this: "I hope to ruin the appetite of every son of a bitch that ever eats in that room." Period. He called them rich bastards, and he said this place was going to be somewhere where these rich bastards come to feed and show off to each other. And he just resented this entire idea of his work accompanying that sort of social exchange, or his work being anywhere near that type of, the very picture of greed and what's wrong with the rich elite. So he wanted to make these snobby restaurant goers feel as if they were trapped in a room where the walls and doors have been bricked up. He wanted to induce something so anxiety-inducing, so terrorizing. And then at a certain point he decided, hold on, these are way too profound to hang in such a commercial environment. So he said they weren't going to be wasted. He gave back the money to the people who paid him to do it, and instead he gave the paintings to the Tate in London, where they still hang today. You can go see them. So let's look at these. The color red is a great vehicle to convey intense human emotion, whether that's love, rage, anger, despair. You can see the velocity with which he painted these paintings. The edges are hazy. There's colors coming towards you and there's colors rushing away from you. If you unfocus your eyes a bit, it's almost like the corners of them are moving. They're moving around. There's nothing static on the painting. So the Serra Murals are some of his best work, and some of his most interesting work too, when you know the backstory. All right, 1964, we have the Rothco Chapel. Now, the Rothco Chapel is exactly what it sounds like. This is a non-denominational place of worship. It is meant to be used by the public for whatever the public needs it for. They do communal meetings here. They do poetry readings. There's music. The Dalai Lama's been, Nelson Mandela have given speeches. It's like this really beautiful public chapel, not in the traditional sense of what a chapel is, but in the sense that a chapel is supposed to be for worship or spiritual reflection. And that doesn't have to be Christian. It doesn't have to be tied to any religion. That can be just general spiritualism. So knowing that around this time, or in the 40s, 50s, he was reading a lot of Nietzsche and Jung and exploring the unconscious, that coupled with there were some patrons at the time who contacted Rothko, had met him and were big fans. They commissioned this from him. The patrons wanted to create a non-denominational place of worship where contemporary art serves as a vehicle of spiritual growth as opposed to traditional religious art. So when you think of the Sistine Chapel, when you think of religious frescoes or murals, so much of art history is dominated by religious imagery. I mean, up until what, the 14th century, when everything was religious art, you know, and at least in Europe. And breaking away from that, Rothko kind of took the opposite approach. Okay, we're in a chapel. You look at the Sistine Chapel ceiling and it's just maximalist religious imagery. What if we did the absolute antithesis of that and made it completely dark? We made it void of anything. Anything. It's not telling you what you should be thinking about. It's not telling you what you should be praying about. It's not telling you anything. It is a mirror. You're looking at what your mind wants to see. So this sits in an octagonal room. It's 14 large-scale canvases, and they're all black. Every single one of them. This chapel is meant for spiritual contemplation. There's a skylight in the ceiling. There's benches in the middle. It's a very personal, emotional thing. I read one critique saying that the color black is, you know, in theory, it's all colors together at once. And I think that allows for some interesting introspection, you know, to sit in there and think about just everything, just how beautifully tragic it is to be alive, and all the complexities and the depths of that statement, and how each person has their own wants and desires and passions. And, you know, we can either alienate each other and spread vitriol and hatred, or we can love each other and we can, you know, be interconnected as a human race. And so I really love the concept of the Rothco Chapel, because we need more of that, you know? It's the big tornado of human life summed up on a canvas. And that canvas happens to just be blank, which I think is amazing. So approaching 1970, Rothko gets a medical diagnosis and we see his eventual suicide. Mark Rothko had an aortic aneurysm around this time. He was a heavy drinker, a heavy smoker, and he was known to play around with pills. He was divorced at this time from, I think, his second or third wife. And everything in Rothko's life just became constant and deafening all the time. He eventually overdosed on barbiturates, and he self-mutilated his arm, and he was found dead on his kitchen floor by his studio assistant in 1970. His last few years were very dark, and like I said earlier, you can kind of see that reflected in his work. And some art historians would disagree, whatever. He felt guilty about making money from his work. He felt that with an exchange for, you know, the complexity of what he was creating, exchanging that for money just felt a little like he was a commodity, you know, like these pieces were a commodity. He died with over 800 works in his collection, unsold. He was very particular about who he sold art to. He had to kind of vet them. I think he had a vetting process for, are you buying this for the right reason? You know, now that he's sadly dead, he can't control that as much. I'm sure maybe the Rothko estate does, but to buy and own a Rothko, he wanted to make sure that you got it, which is kind of counterintuitive because people can enjoy a painting for a multitude of different reasons. And him saying, you know, it's all about the idea and the viewer, but then him saying, well, you're not getting it right, is kind of, you know, I find that a little ironic, but I get it. You know, you don't want to let these paintings be misunderstood or be simplified or reduced down to what most people see upon first glance. You know, that's just some squares on a painting. No, it's not. It's so much more than that. So he was very protective over who got to own his work. The drama of Rothko's life and works crescendos in his death, I think. Just troubled and deep and sublime and all-encompassing and deafening up until the very end. The impact Rothko left is, I think, very few have rivaled when it comes to modern art. And what he attempted to do and was successful in doing was summing up this bullshit, you know, the human experience, and just how daunting it is. If you've never seen a Rothko in real life, I would Google his works are spread all throughout the world. There might be one close to you. I would Google and see if there's a museum near you or in the biggest city near you that you could go stand in front of one. And I would be really curious to see what you guys think. And let me know in the comments if you've ever stood in front of a Rothko, if you've maybe passed over one before, you've never really given it much thought. I definitely fell into that category. It's part of the reason why I picked this topic is, you know, what's going on there? What am I missing? And I'm so glad I did. I feel I related to it a lot. So thanks for listening, guys. And if you enjoyed this episode of my art history series, I have a whole playlist. Go check them out. Some of the videos from a while ago, I look like a baby in them. Me and Stanley have been doing these videos since 2020, and I look like a literal child. Not my voice is quiet and I'm like whispering. Bitch, grow up. It's crazy to see kind of the evolution. So yeah, go watch those. There's a whole series. Thanks for watching. Go subscribe to my podcast if you want to as well. Thank you, Stanley, for editing my videos, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, team.